Oh yeah, here we go.
We're here!
Hi.
Hello. Welcome to Marx 3, the final of the vodcast on Marx.
Right.
It doesn't get any better, does it? It's getting worse. The kind of basic competence of the
Functions.
machine. It's really poor. I apologise.
So this is roughly what we're going to cover today. Labour as eternal law. The concept of subsumption, which is not something that we've encountered in the reading here, but is important to know. It's a term that is specifically associated with Marx today, and important to know if you perform a Marxist critique. The concept of surplus population, which is again something that we're not explicitly covering in the reading, but again is important to know. And the last thing is affective responses to capitalism. So we're going to start with the labour process and its subsumption to capitalism and capitalist time. So in previous weeks we have talked about capitalism's obsession with time, capitalism which redefines time and redefines the working day, which is something we're obviously looking at in this week's reading, the section on the working day specifically, and also the redefinition of life as a working life under capitalism specifically. So for Marx, the labour process, as he discusses in that particular section of Capital, is something that is eternal, but the eternity is not to do with how it is subsumed or how it functions under capitalism, but the labour process itself is that which always exists for Marx, but not its subsumption to capitalism, not its absorption into capitalist production. In the section on the labour process, Marx talks about how man, and you might want to think about the gendering of the labourer on the one hand and nature on the other hand. Nature is something that exists there and must be transformed by the forces of man's body or through the forces of man's body. Man is the agent and nature is the sort of passive recipient of man's actions. Man acts on the external world and thereby changes it. Although it's quite interesting as well when you think about that, because for Marx you can't change yourself without also changing the world, and conversely you can't change the world without also changing yourself. But nonetheless you might want to think about the quite problematic gendering of this process here. But anyway, so for Marx, the labour process is something that exists eternally. It's something that we, e.g. the humans, have always done, but the way that this labour process has become absorbed into capitalist production is not at all eternal, nor is it natural, which is something that we discussed last week. So capital is dead labour, that vampire-like only lives by sucking living labour and lives more the more labour it sucks. This is also something that we're going to discuss in relation to what we call the death function of capitalism. And on the right hand side of this slide, the whole labour process belongs to the capitalist. But as I've said, this is not an eternal process. What is eternal is the labour process itself and not its absorption into capitalist production. For Marx, labour is the eternal natural condition for human existence. This in itself is a statement that you might also want to subject to considerable scrutiny, but for the time being we will accept that to proceed with this broadcast. So, the labour process, as Marx says, is the means to endless capital. It appears in the capitalist production process merely as a means, while the valorization process or the production of surplus value appears as the goal. So the labour process, to refer back to the earlier slides, is about how it's subsumed to capitalism, how the labour process is subsumed to capitalist dictates. And the only thing that capitalism is interested in is the creation of surplus value. The only thing it cares about is profit. If you think back to previous week's readings as well, when you thought about the limitlessness of capital and the fact that capital cannot abide a limit, that is its driving force, the desire for endless capital is what drives capitalism endlessly onward. We are going to touch a little bit on the concept of alienation and vampirism. Under capitalism, the worker does not work for herself, but for the capitalist. Your own labour is experienced as a result as alien, because the products that you produce don't belong to you, but belong to the capitalist who exploits you. So the worker is compelled to sell her labour, her own labour capacity as a commodity. This is something that we talked about in the first section on Marx, the commodification of labour, because the way that a commodity is valued is through the amount of congealed labour power trapped inside a commodity, confronted with means of subsistence and means of production as alien property. So the products that we make don't belong to us, but belong to the capitalist, which means that our own labour, we experience our own labour as alien property. Through the incorporation of living labour capacity into objective components of capital, the latter becomes endowed with life and begins to function as though it had love in its bosom. This relates back to the earlier quotation that capitalism sucks out living labour and in the process deadens labour, and it itself seems to come alive. This is the death function of capitalism. It's interesting as well to think about capitalism in relation to love, which we think about later on in this podcast as well. So capitalism seems to be alive while you yourself have been reified. The concept of subsumption then, if you want to find out more about this concept, you should look up the direct process of production, which you can access for free online. So the labour process is something that exists prior to capitalism, as Marx says. It's something that exists eternally, naturally for Marx. But the way that it functions under capitalism is different. This concept of subsumption relates to how labour is absorbed into the process of capitalist production. He makes two kinds of distinctions in the direct process of production between what he calls formal and real subsumption of labour under capital. And the word subsumption means to be brought under the command. Formal subsumption for Marx, I'll just read out this citation, where a formal subsumption of the labour process under capitalism takes place and occurs on the basis of an existing labour process, which was there before its subsumption under capital and was formed on the basis of various earlier processes of production and other conditions of production, which means that the labour process is there prior to capitalism, like, for example, tilling in the fields, so it existed before capitalism, but it is then roped into and absorbed into the system. That is what formal subsumption means. So it's a labour process that exists prior to capitalism, but is subsumed, brought under the command of capitalist production. This formal subsumption stands in contrast to what Marx calls real subsumption. The real subsumption is if changes occur in the production process itself. With the real subsumption of labour under capital, there takes place a complete and constant, continuous and repeated revolution in the mode of production itself, in the productivity of labour, and in the relation between capitalist and worker. If formal subsumption takes something, a labour process like the tilling of a field that existed prior to the capitalist system of production, it doesn't alter that kind of labour process. It only, as it were, appropriates it. That is formal subsumption. It appropriates a labour process that existed before. Real subsumption, that's what happens when the production process itself is changed by the capitalist mode of production. For example, you might want to think about new machines, so that the labour process as a whole is reorganised through the integration of new machinery, etc. So on the right hand side, the labour process reorganised through, for example, new machines to meet capitalist dictates, and the capitalist dictate, as we've seen, is the creation of surplus value, and only the creation of surplus value. Formal subsumption, so if capitalist gets hold of a labour process that existed before it, formal subsumption only works on a relatively small scale and presupposes a small capitalist. This small capitalist is only marginally distinct from the workers themselves, so there's not much difference between the worker and the capitalist in formal subsumption. With the formal subsumption of labour under capitalism, the compulsion to do surplus labour and the creation of free time for development independently of material production merely take on a different form from that of earlier modes of production, but it is a form that heightens the continuity and intensity of labour and increases production. So you might increase the labour time and thereby increase production, but there's not that much of a difference between the capitalist and the worker. So Marx says that formal subsumption presupposes small capitalists alone who are only marginally distinct from the workers themselves in their training and mode of employment. Nonetheless, this formal subsumption, regardless of its small scale, is nonetheless a relation of domination and subordination, even though the labour process itself is not transformed by its subsumption to capitalist rule. That only happens with real subsumption, e.g. the transformation of the real nature of the labour process and its real conditions. So with the integration of machines, for example. Capitalist production, as we have seen in previous weeks, seizes on all spheres. The capitalist mode of production develops the productivity of labour, the amount of production, the size of the population, and the size of the surplus population. With the capital and labour thus released, new branches of business are constantly called into existence, a bit like mushrooms. This is a constant process. At the same time, capitalist production tends to conquer all branches of industry it has not yet taken control of, where there is as yet only formal subsumption. This seizing on all spheres links back to what we discussed in previous weeks, e.g. the limitlessness of capitalism and capital, the way that capitalism operates voraciously like a cancer. And you might also want to think about this term that I've highlighted in red, this idea of release, of being released. This links back to a rhetoric that Marx talks about at greater length in Capital, which is that of being set free. The worker is set free when she is no longer needed. Last year we had a staff release scheme operating at the University of Sheffield, which was a scheme of voluntary redundancy. It's the same kind of language that is used there. This being set free from the labour that you have performed or are performing for the capitalist. This obviously also presupposes that you are disposable. There's all sorts of disposable labour forces in the world today, and that links to this kind of concept of the surplus population, which, if you're interested in that, which I highly recommend, you can look at chapter 25 of Capital, Volume 1. This concept of the surplus population, let me just quickly check because I forget. Okay, so Marx distinguishes three separate categories of a surplus population: the floating, the latent, and a stagnant. I am actually amazed that I don't have it here. Oh yeah, we do have it later. Well, we get to that later then. So the surplus population, basically the idea is that you cannot accumulate wealth without accumulating labour power. As we've seen, the creation of surplus value, the creation of profit can only occur through labour power. So in order to accumulate profit, in order to assemble wealth, you need labour power, and you need labour to produce surplus value. So the reproduction of labour power, which must incessantly be reincorporated into capital as its means of valorization, which cannot get free of capital, forms, in fact, a factor in the reproduction of capital itself. Accumulation of capital is therefore multiplication of the proletariat. So you can't create wealth without also creating a pool of labouring poor. This is a quotation on the right-hand side. And this is also in Capital, Marx engages with folk like Malthus, who we've come across in the section on Darwin. And what Marx is taking issue with here is that people like Malthus argue that poverty is a natural condition. Marx says, no, it ain't. Poverty is that which is created as an essential condition for capitalism to quote-unquote work. Poverty is not natural because of scarcity in nature and rising population, e.g. it's not enough food to go around for everyone, which is some of the arguments that Marxist contemporaries advanced. But poverty is instead created by capitalism, which has to rely on a mass of the labouring poor and pools of labour power as yet unused, used temporarily and then set free or released. So capital, as Marx argues, is nourished. It lives because of the massive disposable labour populations whose labour power it drains and feeds on. Poverty, as such, as Marx argues, is the fundamental condition that must be maintained in order for profit and wealth to be generated. Capitalism must create poverty, otherwise it can't exist. So the worker functions as raw material, which is something that we've also come across in previous weeks. But if a surplus population of workers is a necessary product of accumulation or of the development of wealth on a capitalist basis, the surplus population also becomes, conversely, the lever of capitalist accumulation. Indeed, it becomes a condition for the existence of the capitalist mode of production. This is absolutely essential. Poverty is an essential condition for the existence of its mode of production. It forms a disposable reserve army, a pool of labouring poor, as Marx writes elsewhere, which belongs to capital just as absolutely as if the latter had bred it at its own cost. Independently of the limits of the actual increase of population, it creates a mass of human material always ready for exploitation by capital. So Marx distinguishes between a reserve army, which is the surplus population, those that sometimes have work and can then be released, set free or discarded, and the active army of workers, which includes, at this point in time, John and myself. So there is always a threat of being set free if our labour is no longer needed or deemed to be necessary. So yes, I've covered this. So the active army is overworked, whereas the reserve army is kept in a condition of more or less abject poverty. This reserve army, as Marx convincingly argues, is the necessary condition for the capitalist mode of production. So, and in chapter 5 of Capital, Marx distinguishes between these three types of surplus population, floating, latent and stagnant. The floating surplus population are the ones that drift in and out of work. So you yourselves might well be a floating surplus population if you have a job for a while and then are set free by your employer. There is also the latent surplus population, which in Marx's time were predominantly women and children, so those who were not yet fully proletarianized or subsumed into the capitalist mode of production. But you might also want to think as the student as a latent surplus population if you're not working as yet, and the university is a sort of machine to get you readied for the working life that you must inevitably assume unless you have some sort of trust fund. The stagnant surplus population are those that are too broken to function, the homeless, possibly the mentally ill, unable to work, unable to function under the system. Marx also calls the stagnant surplus population the lumpenproletariat, pauperism, or what William Julius Wilson calls the underclass. The accumulation of wealth on one pole is therefore at the same time the accumulation of misery, the torment of labour, slavery, ignorance, brutalisation and moral degradation at the opposite pole, i.e. on the side that produces its own product as capital. If you don't know this as yet, this is the sort of absolutely convincing argument that capitalism, the accumulation of wealth, brings with it the absolute brutalisation of the population it relies on for the production of surplus value and profit. So absolute wealth brings with it, on the other hand, absolute deprivation. That is the condition for the creation of wealth, is deprivation here as well as elsewhere on this planet.
One of the challenges of reading and thinking about Marx is that it can sometimes feel very dry. So Marx's theory is an economic theory. Marx is a political economist, and perhaps in reading Capital over the last few weeks, you have been beset, as I always am, by the endless fucking linen that takes what is a very kind of ethically informed, politically committed system and appears to make it seem something like the subject of a dry calculation. And what I'm going to try to do in relation to the next 3 or 4 slides is to reinstill some sense of the affective dimension of Marx's theory, which is to say, to tap it back into a sense of the emotional weight, the ethical force of Marx's writing, and how that is obviously the ultimate grounds of this theory. It's a theory that is concerned with beings and their relationship, with a view to an ethical commitment to making beings exist with one another in a better ethical relationship than they have hitherto. There's plenty of stuff in Marx and in Marxist writing that is really helpful in encouraging us to think about the affective dimensions of capitalist theory. So I picked up Engels' Condition of the Working Class in England from the mid-1840s this morning. So this is a text that is very literary. Some of Marx is literary, some of it isn't. But Engels' Condition of the Working Class in England reads in parts like a kind of Dickens novel, like one of the great realist novels of the 19th century. And so that idea of absolute wealth and absolute poverty is rendered in Engels' writing in a much more literary, much more emotionally infused terms. So he writes, "Close to the splendid houses of the rich, such a lurking place of the bitterest poverty may often be found." So that same relation between absolute wealth and absolute poverty appears in Engels, but in terms that pay more particular attention to the emotional effect of this, with quite emotive language, talking about the bitterest poverty, the lurking place of the slums. So there are 3 kinds of affective responses to Marx's writing I'm going to suggest here. The first is the joy of critique. So this is a short section from Susan Rosenthal's The Myth of Personal Life Under Capitalism from the Socialist Review. "When questioning is not acceptable, we conclude that the questioning part of ourselves is not acceptable. after a lifetime of suppressing our own questioning, it feels natural to suppress our children's questioning. They must do as we say and not talk back. After all, it is for their own good. Transforming inquisitive children into obedient producing and reproducing machines requires a persistent shaming process that compels us to reject every part of ourselves that might rebel. Our curiosity, our need to be heard and valued, and the need to actively shape our lives and our world. As a result, we cannot be complete human beings. When we believe that parts of ourselves are unworthy, we are ashamed to show ourselves, and our relationships remain superficial and insecure. When we cannot show who we are, we cannot believe that we are loved for who we are. Critique in Marxist thought, perhaps in thought more generally, is incredibly important as a mode of exteriority to capitalism's interior logic. So if you feel at any moment, in a moment perhaps of profound cynicism, that everything is lost and we're all trapped forever in the machine of capitalism, critique is that which allows you, perhaps idealistically, to step out of that fatalistic sense of enclosure. And this is, after all, what education is for, whether in universities or outside universities, to think differently. And of course, one of the functions or the operations of all tyrannies forever, all fundamentalisms, is to close down ideas of thought, of questioning, as in this quotation from Rosenthal. And this, of course, is why cynics, such perhaps as we, might be very nervous about the way in which critical thought, the arts and humanities, have been increasingly poorly funded over recent years, as if the rise of the neoliberal capitalist system since the late 1970s has as its natural counterpart the closure or the erasure of critique. So this is why there's not only a moral obligation to think critically about the world, but also a pleasure in resituating yourself through critique, through the power of the intellectual life in relation to dominant political systems. So this is affective as well. So this is an emotional as well as an intellectual act to think differently about the world and the politics we're living in. Some more theorization of how we approach the task of, how you emotionally approach the task of theorizing our relationship to capitalism. So I'm drawing here on a French philosopher, Paul Ricoeur, who comes up with this idea of the hermeneutics of suspicion, which is involved in Marx's critique in deciphering false consciousness. So hermeneutics is the act of working stuff out. So it's interpretive puzzles. So it's like you see the world as like a riddle, and you try and work out what the answer to the riddle is. And Ricoeur argues that in a Marxist frame of mind, this joy of critique that I've just said is beset by a kind of paranoia or suspicion. So when you're trying to riddle out how the world works, or how a literary texts work, or how a song operates, you're always looking to interpret it in terms of some massive conspiracy, some kind of like victim complex that leads you towards dark undercurrents. So, of course, the famous saying is that just because you're paranoid doesn't mean that people aren't after you. But there is a certain dissatisfaction about thinking only in terms of paranoid readings, about thinking that everything in the world is folded up irrevocably into a massive conspiracy. And Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick, most notable in relation to queer theory, has something approaching an antidote to this. So, first of all, she writes about the methodological centrality of suspicion to current critical practice, and says that this is involved a concomitant privileging of the concept of paranoia, against which she posits the reparative motive of seeking pleasure. So you read critically, not just because you're paranoid and you want to see how wrong everything is, but because this is infused by an idea that you might wish to repair, perhaps even to heal, to make things better. And there is a kind of pleasure in that as well. Or we might read not just for suspicion, but just for a more innocent joy as well, if anything can be innocent ever anyway. Lastly, the question of love in the time of capitalism. So this is like the ultimate example of a hermeneutics of suspicion. So we think characteristically of love as that which is deepest, most inauthentic, most authentic rather to our heart. So the heart stands in for this sea of kind of deep, genuine feeling. But of course, it's also susceptible to a Marxist analysis. So here is this kind of hyper-cynical description of love by Christian Lotz against the sensualist conceptions of love towards a social material theory. A very dry title for what we would like to think, I suppose, characteristically is the least dry thing, what is kind of warmest and most intimate. But rather, in Lotz's formulation, put simply, love under capitalism must be able to become part of the overall capital accumulation and its principle of generating more money out of money. Love can only exist as a general form of social relationship if it is productive in the favour of capital. So there's a lot of reading you can do to back this up. In Foucault, for example, in his theories of sexuality, how they are related very intimately with the development of capitalism and the bourgeoisie in the 18th century and beyond. There's also a very surprising source of information about this in Philip Larkin, who, ever the cynic about love, writes in the last stanza of Love Songs in Age what I think is a much more poetic summary of Lotz's view, which does pretty much the same thing though. So Love Songs in Age is a poem about an aging woman who discovers the love songs that she had enjoyed in her youth, and the poem ends. The glare of that much-mentioned brilliance love broke out to show its bright incipience sailing above, still promising to solve and satisfy and set unchangeably in order. So to pile them back, to cry was hard, without lamely admitting how it had not done so then, and could not now. So a Marxist, reading those lines, sees love's promise to solve, satisfy and set unchangeably in order as the most cynical aspect of capitalism, that popular cultural representations of love in the kind of songs that are being talked about in these poems have an ideological function to distract you from the immiseration of your condition and to offer you this dream, this illusion of salvation through heteronormative intimacy. So love is what's going to sort everything out rather than the revolution. I don't wish to try and persuade you of this, but rather to invite you to think about how far it's possible to disentangle emotion and politics. And this is one of the tasks that we'll invite you to ponder for the next class. So to start with, some rigorous stuff. So we need to keep focusing on the text, keep focusing on the terminology to drive our learning forward. So the first part of the workshop, we'll think about surplus value, labour process, capitalism's death function. I will encourage you to go beyond these extracts to connect with other parts of the course material. So that's your rigorous scholarly engagement with Marxist theory. But also I'd invite you to ponder what it feels like to live under capitalism. So how do you connect what you've learned on Marx with a wider experience of the world? Do you feel alienated from your labour? Do you feel like the lumpen proletariat? Do you feel floating, latent or stagnant?
Thank you very much.